It was a crisp morning when two joggers, making their usual rounds along the highway, stumbled upon something that would change their lives forever. Beneath a bridge, hidden from plain sight, lay the lifeless body of Keith Cato Barnes. His body was positioned unnaturally, a clear sign that it had been moved after death. The disturbing post-mortem injuries, consistent with blunt force trauma, told a story of violence that was not immediately apparent in the quiet, industrial area where his body had been discarded. The joggers, shaken by the grisly find, called the authorities, setting in motion an investigation that would uncover a complex web of debts, betrayal, and a brutal murder. As the scene was processed by investigators, it quickly became clear that Cato's death was no random act of violence. The way his body had been positioned under the bridge and the disturbing signs of being dragged suggested something far more calculated. The forensic team would soon confirm that Cato had been moved from a different location before being left to be discovered. His shoes, in particular, held clues that would take investigators across town to an abandoned lumber yard, an unassuming location that would soon become the focal point of a shocking crime. But Cato's death was only the beginning. What appeared to be a tragic and unexplained murder would soon reveal itself as the result of a much deeper and darker set of circumstances. A financial struggle, an angry creditor, and a broken trust would set the stage for a cold and violent end to a life that, until then, had been lived in the shadows. Keith Cato Barnes was no stranger to the darker side of life. He had carved out a living in the gritty underbelly of the city, a small-time loan shark who operated in the gray areas of legality. His business was a far cry from the clean, respectable dealings of the mainstream financial world. Instead, Cato thrived by lending money to individuals who were desperate and willing to pay the steep price of high-interest loans. Though he wasn't a major figure in the criminal world, his reputation was known to those who had dealings in the streets. Some saw him as a necessary evil, while others viewed him as a dangerous man with too much power for his size. Born and raised in the city, Cato had been shaped by a tough environment. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood, he learned early on how to survive by relying on his wits and street smarts. His personal life was just as complicated. He had been married once, but that union dissolved over time, mostly due to Cato's increasingly erratic and dangerous behavior as his debts grew. His ex-wife, though long separated from him, still felt the weight of the financial strain he left behind. But there was a deeper emotional toll too, one of a relationship built on broken promises and betrayal. Despite the chaos, Cato's debts had reached a point where even the most lenient creditors could no longer ignore him. At the time of his death, he owed money to several people, but none more important than a small-time lender who had been growing increasingly impatient. This lender, a man with a reputation for not tolerating missed payments, was someone Cato had borrowed from many times before. Their relationship, once based on mutual understanding, had soured into a dangerous game of cat and mouse. With Cato's life becoming more unstable by the day, it seemed inevitable that this lender, who had his own shady connections, would play a pivotal role in the events that would follow. But there's more to Cato's story. His death was not merely the result of a financial dispute. It was the culmination of years of poor choices, debts that spiraled out of control, and a criminal world that rarely left anyone unscathed. To understand the full scope of his life and the forces at play, We need to dive deeper into the connections, the pressures, and the people that Cato encountered. If you're as intrigued as we are by this case, don't forget to subscribe to Beyond the Evidence for more in-depth investigations like this one. Our team is committed to uncovering the truths that lie beneath the surface, bringing you the real stories behind the headlines. Keith Cato Barnes had a complex web of relationships that seemed to reflect the duality of his life, a man caught between the legitimate world and the criminal underworld, trying to survive in a life built on debts and distrust. Among those closest to him was his ex-wife, who still carried the emotional scars of their failed marriage. Though they had been separated for years, Cato's financial instability and reckless decisions continued to affect her. She had hoped that time apart would allow for healing, but his debts and the lingering shadow of his actions were a constant reminder of the chaos he brought into her life. Though they had no children together, Cato's turmoil affected her ability to move on fully, and at times, she found herself reflecting on the man he had once been before he had allowed the pressures of debt to consume him. Beyond his ex-wife, Cato maintained connections with others in the community, business partners, small-time criminals, and a handful of people who seemed to tolerate his presence for reasons of their own. But there was one person whose relationship with Cato would prove to be far more significant than the others, a small-time lender named Leroy Collins. Leroy, much like Cato, lived in the margins, operating a lending business with high interest rates and a no-nonsense attitude toward repayment. It was not unusual for Cato to find himself deep in debt with Leroy, and their dynamic had evolved over time into something more akin to an unspoken truce, with Leroy willing to lend Cato money, but expecting immediate payment, an expectation Cato could never seem to meet. The strain between Cato and Leroy had been growing for months. Cato's debts had accumulated far beyond what he could repay, and his financial dealings were becoming more erratic. It wasn't just the money that created tension between the two. It was also the trust that had slowly eroded over time. Cato had borrowed large sums, only to stall on payments or offer vague assurances of coming up with the money. Leroy, who was known for his cold and ruthless demeanor, wasn't the type to let anyone off the hook easily. His patience was wearing thin, and as the pressure mounted, so did the threats. Cato, in his desperate attempt to stay afloat, found himself more and more reliant on Leroy, even as their relationship soured into a volatile mix of fear and resentment. Leroy was not the only figure in Cato's life who saw the cracks in his character. Some of Cato's old friends, though they never fully trusted him, had remained on the fringes of his life, offering occasional support. But Cato had long since burned many of these bridges, making enemies along the way as he navigated a world where money and power meant everything. His tendency to get too close to people, then push them away when things went wrong, only added to the distance he felt from anyone who might have once cared about him. Despite these personal failings, Cato remained a figure of intrigue in the eyes of those around him. His outward bravado, his charm when he needed it, and his ability to move between circles of influence made him a survivor in a world that chewed people up and spit them out. But it was this very survival instinct that led him down a path where his personal relationships became transactional. Cato was always calculating, always weighing his next move, but it wasn't enough to save him from the consequences of his actions. As the pressure mounted from Leroy and others, Cato's life became a powder keg, with his every decision pushing him closer to an explosive outcome. The complexity of Cato's relationships, particularly with Leroy, would eventually set the stage for the deadly confrontation that would follow. As the days passed without word from Keith Cato Barnes, those closest to him began to notice the absence. Cato's ex-wife, still entangled in the remnants of their broken marriage, was the first to grow concerned. Though she had grown accustomed to his unpredictable behavior and fleeting disappearances, something felt different this time. His usual excuses never came. The phone calls, the casual messages, none of it came through. Cato had vanished, and this time there was no sign that he would return. His absence was felt even more acutely by Leroy Collins, the small-time lender who had become a key figure in Cato's life. Leroy had been growing increasingly impatient with Cato's unpaid debts, but now, with Cato nowhere to be found, the situation became even more unsettling. It wasn't like Cato to simply disappear without a trace, especially when there was money on the line. Investigators soon discovered that Cato's disappearance had been accompanied by a series of subtle but telling signs. The first was his car, which had been found abandoned several miles from his last known location. It wasn't unusual for Cato to park in places that didn't seem to make sense. After all, he was no stranger to shady dealings. But the condition of the car was different. It was locked, with no indication of a struggle or forced entry. The vehicle was clean, almost too clean, as though it had been tampered with. Nothing about the scene felt natural, and the discovery of the car raised more questions than it answered. The second warning sign came in the form of Cato's phone records, which showed a series of suspiciously brief calls just before his disappearance. The final call was made to a number Cato had dialed several times in the past, Leroy Collins. The call was brief, lasting only a minute, and after that, Cato was never heard from again. It wasn't a simple case of a man running off to escape his problems. This was something far more sinister. In the days that followed, Cato's disappearance began to make headlines, and a sense of urgency spread among his friends and family. Investigators, piecing together the fragments of Cato's final moments, began to trace his last known movements. His financial records revealed an escalating spiral of debt, culminating in a final, desperate confrontation with Leroy. Yet, the police had no concrete evidence to connect Leroy to Cato's disappearance, leaving them with only circumstantial clues. The only thing investigators could rely on was the theory that Cato's mounting debts had pushed him into a corner, one from which he couldn't escape. As the investigation deepened, another chilling clue came to light, a small but telling detail that would shift the direction of the case. A local jogger, making her usual route along the highway, had noticed something peculiar. A trail of muddy footprints leading away from the highway bridge where Cato's body would later be discovered. The footprints, along with the odd position of Cato's body, suggested he had been moved, dragged perhaps, before being discarded under the bridge. There was a sense of urgency in the way his body had been positioned, as if the killer had been trying to hide the crime or rush to avoid being seen. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together, and with each new discovery, the investigation pointed to one man, Leroy Collins. The timeline was becoming clearer, and the evidence was starting to add up. But there were still more questions than answers. Why had Cato suddenly disappeared? What had transpired in the final days of his life? And why, despite the mounting evidence, was Leroy still walking free? As the investigation into Keith Cato Barnes's disappearance continued to unfold, it was clear that the case was no longer a simple missing persons inquiry. The growing evidence of foul play painted a grim picture, and the detectives involved in the case knew they were dealing with something far darker than they had initially suspected. The most significant breakthrough came when the investigators turned their attention to an abandoned lumber yard on the outskirts of town. The yard had been a place Cato was known to frequent, though it was unclear what, if anything, had drawn him there in recent weeks. A routine search of the lumber yard quickly turned into a pivotal moment in the investigation. It began with a curious discovery: drag marks. The area behind one of the larger storage units showed clear signs that something, or someone, had been dragged through the dirt and gravel. The marks led to an isolated corner of the yard, where investigators found a blood-soaked tarp half hidden behind a stack of old wooden beams. The bloodstains were fresh, and the sight of it sent a chill down the detective's spines. It was not just the large amount of blood that raised suspicion. It was the methodical way in which it had been disposed of. The killer had gone to great lengths to conceal evidence, as if they were well aware of the importance of covering their tracks. The tarp was examined thoroughly, and although it had been hastily discarded, it contained enough forensic evidence to confirm that it had been used to wrap Cato's body. The investigators could see traces of Cato's blood and clothing fibers embedded in the fabric. But more telling was the soil found on the tarp. Soil analysis, particularly the unique trace elements found in Cato's shoes, linked the crime scene to the lumber yard. It was now clear that Cato had been dragged across town, transported from wherever he had been killed to this remote location, and then discarded like a piece of trash. At the same time, the detectives were piecing together the puzzle of Cato's last days. His phone records revealed a startling connection. Just days before his disappearance, Cato had been in regular contact with Leroy Collins, his small-time lender. The phone records showed a pattern of calls that seemed to escalate in intensity, with Cato calling Leroy more frequently in the days leading up to his vanishing. But it wasn't just the calls that raised eyebrows, it was the timing. Cato had been trying to negotiate a payment arrangement with Leroy, but the pressure was mounting. Leroy, known for his ruthlessness, had begun to demand more than Cato could offer, and the tension between them had reached a boiling point. But it was not just the financial pressure that had caused this escalation. Cato had been in increasingly desperate circumstances. His debts were growing, and Leroy's demands had become more insistent. Cato had even started avoiding his usual haunts, possibly trying to escape the clutches of his lender. Yet, no matter where Cato went, the shadow of his debt loomed over him. It became apparent that the relationship between Cato and Leroy was not just about money. It had become a dangerous game of power, control, and intimidation. As the investigation gathered momentum, the detectives realized that they were getting closer to the truth. The signs were all pointing in one direction. Cato had been killed in a violent confrontation, possibly over the money he owed Leroy, and then hastily disposed of at the lumber yard. The signs of struggle, the blood-soaked tarp, and the drag marks leading to the isolated corner of the yard painted a clear picture of a murder meticulously planned and executed. It was a brutal crime designed not just to kill, but to silence Cato once and for all. The pieces were falling into place, and Leroy Collins was beginning to look like the prime suspect. However, As the investigators dug deeper, they discovered something even more unsettling, a potential link to other, similar crimes in the area. Cato's death, while tragic and violent, may have been only the latest in a string of similar incidents. The investigation was beginning to unravel a pattern of intimidation, manipulation, and violence, all tied to the dangerous underworld Cato had inhabited. Despite mounting evidence, Leroy remained uncooperative, denying any involvement in Cato's murder. But the detectives knew they were getting closer. With every new piece of evidence, the case was becoming more complex, and the mystery of Cato's death was slowly transforming into a much larger and more sinister narrative. The question now was not just who had killed Cato, but why, and what the full extent of the violence in this small-time lending world truly was. The discovery of Keith Cato Barnes's body sent shockwaves through the small, tight-knit community he had left behind. Those who had known him, even peripherally, were left grappling with the brutal reality of his death. The immediate aftermath was marked by a wave of confusion, disbelief, and a growing sense of dread. For Cato's ex-wife, the news was both a painful reminder of their tumultuous relationship and an unsettling confirmation that the man she had once shared her life with had met a violent end. She was not alone in her grief, but for her, the loss was more complicated, tinged with regret and unspoken emotions. Despite their separation, she could not shake the sense that, had things been different, Cato might still be alive. As the investigation moved forward, detectives began canvassing Cato's acquaintances, trying to piece together his final days. For many, Cato's death was no great surprise. His lifestyle had been riddled with danger, his debts mounting, and his choices often reckless. Still, the brutality of the murder shocked even the most hardened individuals in the neighborhood. Cato was a man who had built a reputation for surviving in the world of small-time loans and underworld dealings. But none of his business dealings could have prepared anyone for the extent of the violence he suffered in the end. While Cato's ex-wife quietly mourned, a more visible reaction came from those who had been directly involved in his financial dealings, particularly Leroy Collins. The small-time lender was visibly shaken by the news, but his reaction raised eyebrows among the detectives. Though some found his outward shock to be genuine, others questioned if it was the reaction of a man whose conscience was weighed down by guilt, or a calculated display to divert suspicion. His relationship with Cato had been fraught with tension, and the detectives could not ignore the possibility that Leroy, who stood to lose the most from Cato's unpaid debts, might be playing a role in manipulating the narrative. Yet, Leroy was not the only one impacted by Cato's death. The local community, though not as directly involved in Cato's world, felt the ripples of his brutal murder. People spoke in hushed tones about Cato's reputation and the dangerous individuals he had associated with. For some, the murder marked the end of an era, a reminder of the fragility of life in a world where money, power, and violence often go hand in hand. For others, the shock was more personal, as Cato had once been a fixture in their lives, if only fleetingly. His death left a void that, for some, was filled with fear and uncertainty about who might be next. As the investigation deepened, it became evident that Cato's death was far from an isolated incident. The detectives uncovered a series of troubling patterns that suggested a larger problem. The small-time lending world that Cato had been part of was more interconnected and dangerous than anyone had anticipated. It was not just a matter of money owed. It was a matter of power and control. Cato's murder, it seemed, was a message, and the full scope of its implications was just beginning to surface. The detectives, while pursuing leads and gathering evidence, struggled to navigate the complex web of relationships surrounding Cato. His friends and associates were wary of speaking out, reluctant to draw attention to their own involvement in the world of loans, debts, and shady dealings. But it was clear that Cato had been entangled in a world of high stakes and low morals, where violence was often the price of failure. For those closest to him, the murder was not just the loss of a man, but a stark reminder of the dangers lurking beneath the surface of their everyday lives. As investigators sifted through the reactions and grief of those closest to Cato, they knew the answers lay hidden within the complex relationships and the delicate balance of power that had ultimately led to his death. The investigation was no longer about merely solving a murder. It was about uncovering the forces that had pushed Cato to his tragic end. The investigation into Keith Cato Barnes's death had been progressing slowly, with the initial breakthrough coming from the bloodstains at the lumber yard. Yet, the case remained elusive, with the key to Cato's death lying just beyond the reach of the detectives. With little more than circumstantial evidence pointing toward Leroy Collins, the investigation had reached an impasse. The breakthrough came unexpectedly, through a piece of evidence that seemed small but would prove to be the pivotal moment in the case. The first crucial discovery came from the blood-soaked tarp found at the lumber yard. Forensic analysis confirmed that the blood on the tarp belonged to Cato, but there was something else that stood out: traces of DNA beneath Cato's fingernails. The initial thought was that these traces could be the result of a struggle, but the forensic team's further examination revealed something far more significant. The DNA matched that of Leroy Collins, Cato's small-time lender. The connection was undeniable. Leroy's DNA had been found under Cato's nails, suggesting that the two had fought in the moments leading up to Cato's death. This discovery was a game-changer. While investigators had suspected Leroy's involvement, the DNA evidence was the confirmation they needed. The forensic team worked tirelessly to piece together the timeline, cross-referencing the DNA findings with other pieces of evidence, like the phone records and the soil samples from the lumber yard. They learned that Leroy's cell phone had pinged off a cell tower near the yard during the critical hours of Cato's murder. The evidence was mounting, and the case against Leroy was becoming airtight. Despite the mounting evidence, Leroy remained stubbornly uncooperative. His alibis seemed weak, and his attempts to deflect suspicion grew more erratic as the investigation wore on. But the more the detectives uncovered, the clearer the picture became. Cato's death was not just the result of a financial dispute. It was the culmination of a dangerous power struggle. Cato had been trapped in a corner by his mounting debts, and Leroy had seen an opportunity to exert control over him. It was a classic case of someone using their power to intimidate and eliminate a threat. With the DNA evidence pointing directly to Leroy, the detectives focused on building their case. They began to investigate Leroy's past, uncovering a pattern of intimidation and violent behavior tied to his lending business. It seemed that Leroy had used fear and manipulation as tools to keep his debtors in line. He had a reputation for being ruthless, and Cato had been no exception. The relationship between the two men, once based on mutual need, had turned toxic, and it seemed that Leroy had decided to take matters into his own hands. Leroy's financial records were also examined, revealing that Cato's unpaid debts were not an isolated issue. Leroy had been running a small but highly profitable operation, and the amount of money Cato owed him had been significant. It was clear that Leroy had no intention of letting Cato off the hook. In fact, it seemed that Cato's death was a direct message, one meant to instill fear in anyone who might have been thinking of crossing Leroy. The brutal nature of the murder, the way Cato's body had been disposed of, and the calculated effort to erase any trace of the crime pointed to a man who had been willing to do anything to maintain control. As the evidence piled up, the detectives began to see the full scope of the case. What had seemed like a routine murder investigation was now a complex and chilling tale of power, control, and violence. Leroy's motive was clear. Cato had become a liability, and in Leroy's eyes, the only way to regain control was through force. The brutal murder of Cato Barnes was not just the result of a financial dispute. It was a calculated act of intimidation that sent a message to anyone who dared to stand in Leroy's way. With the DNA evidence and cell phone data confirming Leroy's presence at the scene during the murder window, the case against him had become undeniable. The detectives were now preparing to confront Leroy with the evidence, knowing that this was the turning point in the case. The next steps were critical. Leroy had to be held accountable for the murder, but the detectives also knew that the investigation had uncovered something even darker, something that could extend far beyond Cato's death. The murder of Keith Cato Barnes, though tragic and violent, left a ripple effect that extended far beyond the immediate crime scene. For those who knew Cato, his death was not just the loss of a man caught in a cycle of debt and desperation. It was a stark reminder of the dangers of the world he inhabited. His ex-wife, once hopeful that time would ease the pain of their fractured relationship, was now left to reflect on the life they had shared and the man Cato had become. While the finality of his death brought some sense of closure, it also left behind a sea of unresolved emotions, regret, anger, and a deep sorrow for the man she had once loved, despite his many flaws. For the community, Cato's murder was an unsettling revelation of the darker forces at play just beneath the surface of everyday life. The underworld of small-time lending and financial manipulation had, until then, been a hidden danger. But the violent end of one of its participants brought the reality of this world into sharp focus. People began to question just how many others were living in the same precarious balance, trying to survive in a system where power, control, and fear governed every transaction. Cato's death was a wake-up call to the very real consequences of unchecked greed and violence. Leroy Collins, now facing charges for Cato's murder, would have to face the consequences of his actions. But for those who had been touched by the ripple effect of Cato's life and death, the damage had already been done. The justice system would deliver its verdict, but for those who had suffered, the scars of Cato's murder would take far longer to heal. As we reflect on this case, we are left to ponder the deeper implications. Cato's tragic end raises important questions about the human cost of financial desperation and the lengths people will go to in order to exert control over others. What do you think? Was Cato's death inevitable, or could it have been prevented? Join the conversation below and share your thoughts. And if you want to see more deep dives into cases like this, make sure to subscribe to Beyond the Evidence for more stories that bring you closer to the truth.